The wife of a naval officer is found dead in a hotel room in Japan. Her injuries were gruesome. She had injuries to her head, face, and jaw. Her family searched for answers for months. Then her husband was suddenly charged with her murder. We're breaking down the shocking details with former federal prosecutor and military vet Andrew Cherkasky.
There was something that triggered it, it would seem, right? They're on this trip at a hotel, and something motivated it.
Thanks for joining us on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service alleged Christopher Olsen viciously beat his wife, strangled her, and left her body in their hotel room. And recently, going against the victim's family's wishes, he accepted a plea deal for less than 25 years in prison. Jessie Olsen and her husband Christopher were college sweethearts. The two reportedly met at State University of New York at Oswego, and by August of 2009, they exchanged I do's. Jessie's sister Dominique previously told the Stars and Stripes they seemed like a normal, loving couple. She said, "We had no idea they ever had issues. None of her friends, even best friend, had an inkling." By April of 2014, Christopher enlisted in the Navy. According to Stars and Stripes, he became a surface warfare officer. Then he rose up the ranks to later being a lieutenant commander. His career even took him to Sasebo, Japan, where he was stationed from November of 2022 to December of 2023. He reportedly served on the USS Chief and the USS New Orleans, before later being assigned to the Naval Surface Group Southwest in San Diego, California. But in October of 2024, the couple traveled back to Japan, even booking a room at the Hotel Seoul, about 80 miles from their former home on Sasebo Naval Base. According to Stars and Stripes, surveillance videos showed the Olsens checking into the hotel on October 25th. But what's strange is, on October 27th, Christopher checked out, but his wife wasn't with him. He left alone and by himself. When hotel staffers were likely preparing for the next guest to check in, they went back to the Olsens' hotel room, and that's where staffers saw Jessie. They immediately called police because she was bleeding and unresponsive. Police confirmed she died inside her hotel room. But how? According to Jessie's sister, the family learned Jessie had injuries to her head, her face, her jaw, and her neck were broken. The following day, police questioned Lieutenant Commander Olsen. Investigators learned Christopher actually extended his stay at the Hotel Seoul, even giving fake info about his wife. He told the hotel staff, "Don't go into the room," which puzzled them. So after raising concerns, they entered the hotel room, and that's how they discovered Jessie's body. Now, normally you would think that might prompt an arrest, or Christopher at the bare minimum would be detained. But he wasn't. He was free to go. It didn't even appear that he let Jessie's family know something happened to her. According to the Stars and Stripes, Jessie's sister found out about her death after the Navy informed them. She told the Stripes there was no in-person visit, no support team, no effort to ensure they were physically or emotionally able to process the news. "We were simply told that Jessie was dead and that her husband, Lieutenant Commander Christopher Olsen, was a person of interest." But for months, Jessie's family went without answers and seemingly barely any updates on the status of the case. According to Jessie's sister, it took a month for Jessie's body to be returned to the U.S., 3 months to get her beloved dog, and 5 months to get her belongings returned. Then 7 months after Jessie was found dead, Christopher was finally charged with her murder. In May of this year, he was charged with second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. It's unclear the full extent of what led up to the naval officer beating and strangling his wife. He was supposed to face a court-martial or a trial for armed service members in Japan next month. Then Jessie's family learned in August Christopher was getting a plea deal. According to the Facebook group Justice for Jessie Olsen, Jessie's sister Dominique wrote, quote, "On September 10th, 2025, Jessie Olsen's husband, the man who murdered her, will appear in court to submit a plea deal that was negotiated against her family's wishes for trial. Now, under the deal, Christopher pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 23 years in prison." Jessie's sister took to the Justice for Jessie Olsen Facebook group and wrote, "Yesterday, September 10th, 2025, Christopher Olsen was found guilty of murder, sentenced to 23 years in prison, dismissed from the Navy in order to pay restitution for Jessie's funeral expenses. While that brings some accountability, no sentence and no payment will ever equal the life Jessie lost." Our focus has always been on Jessie's memory and honoring the vibrant, loving person she was. This chapter may have closed, but our fight for Jessie and true justice is not over. Her story will be made public. There will be no hidden aspects of what he did. I'm joined now by former federal prosecutor and military veteran Andrew Cherkasky. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. Are you surprised that former Lieutenant Commander Christopher Olsen was given a plea deal in his wife's murder? And are you surprised it wasn't for more time? I mean, it was only 23 years in prison.
Well, I think that what's most interesting in this case is that we see that there's conflict with the victim's family, that they don't seem to have supported this. And usually what you see in military cases, and I've tried hundreds of courts-martial trials, and including the most serious types of offenses to include murder, the government, the prosecutors on these cases typically do not agree to settlements or these types of plea deals unless there is support from the victim's family. In fact, there's a very long history of military commanders who are the ones who are in these positions of making these decisions, actually facing relatively severe long-term career consequences if there is outrage by these families. So it's very unusual. The fact of the matter, though, is they took the case on a charge of murder in a non-premeditated form. And with that, there are some sentencing limitations different than a premeditated murder, and perhaps they just didn't have the evidence to get them over the line. And so this was a no-brainer versus the difficulty that comes with a full trial.
And in your opinion, what could have happened had he actually been court-martialed in Japan?
Well, I think that this case is very interesting because there's not a lot of very specific details of what happened in the hotel room. Obviously, he's now admitting, and in the military, where you plead guilty, you have to admit that those are the true facts, that you did these things. It's not like in some civil or civilian criminal courtrooms where you can plead guilty, but really not speak to the truth of whether the facts occurred. So he's locked in that it happened in this hotel room, but there's so many circumstances behind any sort of homicide or even death that happens between two people in a hotel room. What were the circumstances that led to that? Was there some sort of mutual fighting? Was there some sort of long-term issue? Was there other people involved? Are there drugs? Are there mental health illnesses that could all be at play? We don't have a lot of those more specific details. And so I think in the end, with a plea deal being taken like this, it signals to some degree the government was worried about their evidence, while the defense simultaneously is saying that this very long sentence is worth it instead of the risk that they had of losing with far greater punishment.
Andrew, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this. We learned that Christopher Olsen was questioned a day after Jesse Olsen was found dead. Then he was able to leave and he kept on working. He wasn't even charged until May of this year. Why do you think that took so long, especially when it wasn't a situation where she was reported missing, they're looking for her, anything like that? Hotel staffers found her, and they might have, they had that surveillance video that showed them checking in together, but only one person checked out. But I'm interested in your thoughts on why there was such a long gap and a long period of time that went by before he was officially charged.
Well, this happened in Japan. And so the Japanese legal system, their criminal system, actually has primary jurisdiction over service members who are there. So it is not the sort of situation where immediately after a service member is accused of a crime, that the military can throw all of its efforts behind the investigation and the judicial system, for example, locking someone away pre-trial, making moves like that. There is a lot of deference, and in fact, the status of forces agreements, the treaties between us and Japan, it controls how the criminal system is run. It's very inefficient, and it's wildly problematic, I think, for our U.S. service members to be at the whims of the Japanese system, because it is very different, and their sense of justice in some ways could be seen as better than ours, and in some ways much worse than ours, depending whose perspective you have. And so we have service members get caught up in these Japanese sides of the investigations, and that interchange between them and the U.S. military and how they handle service members who are accused of that crime in the Japanese system, and whether they can be locked up in the meantime, is all a very difficult diplomatic negotiation ultimately that occurs. And so sometimes you see it on one side or the other. But within the military, that's a long way for me to get to this. In the military, there is very rarely pre-trial jail, like where people are held without bail pending trial. That very rarely happens in the military because people are under the control of their commanders and their sergeants and the people around them based on the chain of command. And so there's not really the same fear that they'll flee or that they'll have the ability to continue to commit serious crimes because it's such a different controlled environment.
And do you think the story would have played out differently if he went AWOL after this?
I think that what the number one kind of missing piece right now is what he says, what in this plea deal he says actually happened in that hotel room. And I think that there's various versions of how a man who kills his wife does so with degrees of different mitigation. And that's seen in the law. You have things like involuntary manslaughter where it was accidental, or voluntary manslaughter where you were engaging in very reckless activity. And then you have murder where it was with an intent to kill, but not in a premeditated source. So what happened in that moment that overtook him to drive him to want to kill? I think that when you play this out as to what could have been different if the Japanese had handled this differently, or we had handled this differently, if this had moved along in a more rapid pace. I don't know if there's some sort of evidence that went missing or was difficult for the government to capture because of the overseas nature, which meant that they couldn't convincingly try this case without taking a deal and mitigating its risks.
And going back to just the family's kind of objection to the plea deal, are you surprised that officials also weren't more forthcoming with information to her family? According to Jesse's family, when her body was discovered, it wasn't an in-person conversation. It was a call over the phone. There was no emotions to it. It was kind of like a, she is dead, you know, that type of kind of situation. We don't know the full extent of the call and things of that sort. But overall, when a family of a wife of a service member is killed overseas, how does that process work in terms of updating a family member about just the status of the case and the investigation?
Well, I can guarantee you that every single person in the military and civilian or actually in uniform, each with their hearts, care about other service members and their families. However, the bureaucracy is so large, complex, and difficult to manage that at times nobody knows that they're in charge or in control, or that they're doing something that's truly representative of the entirety of the US government as they reach out and interact. And so prosecutors do have obligations under the victim witness assistance program. That's a very standard federal program that deals with people who are victims and witnesses in crimes and in prosecutions. And they are required to give regular updates and whatnot. But here it seems as though there was a lack of the touch that we think of that when we're dealing with the death of somebody who is closely connected to the military. Dependents, the spouses, the children, they're not in the military and they don't have particularly special protections under the law. And overseas, they're very at the whim of that local government. And so, you know, there's a lot that we don't do for them and a lot of jeopardy that they place themselves in when they're overseas. And so this is just a signal that people maybe within that bureaucracy, and that's part of our political debates these days, is, you know, how good or benevolent are those bureaucracies? A lot of individual people with good, big hearts. But when it comes to the bureaucratic process of trying to deal with a death like this and the investigation and the coordination and low-level, inexperienced folks who are often associated with these cases, those details get lost and it doesn't look good on our government.
And, you know, the details of what we do know of the murder are just so gruesome. You know, according to police, he beat her, he strangled her, her jaw was broken, and there was a bone in her neck kind of, you know, connecting the neck to the head. That part was broken. Do you think it's possible that there was kind of abuse throughout their marriage? I mean, it seems like a kind of a great leap to be so vicious against your loved one, against your wife, in just the heat of the moment. It seems like there was maybe possibly signs along the way. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there was something that triggered it. it would seem, right? They're on this trip at a hotel, and something motivated it. It's funny in murder cases, it's not necessary in many cases to identify the actual motive from a legal perspective. But good luck prosecuting a case without a motive. This obviously gives every signal of anger and rage and signs of more than that, that this was particularly punitive or retributive. And so there's obviously a story. We all have very interesting stories, and every bedroom in America between husband and wife, and then imagine around the world, have such interesting dynamics you couldn't believe it. It would blow your mind when you meet them on the streets and then learn what might have happened in their more dark times. And that's often what we deal with in criminal law. And I say this because you see it all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean a crime happened. It can just be the trials and tribulations of jealousy and rage and anger that happen in life and when you're particularly close to someone. But here, this does signal to me that there was obviously some long-term issue, but not enough for the prosecutors to say premeditated. So they went, there must have been evidence that they went there without him thinking that he was going to try to exact some sort of crime against her.
And I'm interested in also knowing your thoughts. You know, they were over in Japan. He wasn't stationed there at the time. He was actually, the family was still stationed in San Diego at that time. So it seems like, that they were just on a vacation together. Maybe something happened, again, not knowing the full extent of it. But also I'm curious, Andrew, in terms of a prison sentence after pleading guilty on a naval base, likely where do you think he'll be serving out his 23-year sentence?
23 years is, I think, right at the mark where he will go to the Army barracks in Kansas. So they've got a long-term barracks for people over, I believe it's 20, it might be 25 years. And so there's a chance he's there, a chance at Miramar. There's facilities all over America. With a 23-year sentence, though, there is a pretty serious decalculation of that, because every day through his sentence, he gets 5 days off per month for good conduct. And so for every year, that's 10 months. And so that really reduces it to some degree. And then there are parole opportunities that he will have along the way, at least by the halfway point. And so he could be in as little as 12, 15 years, maybe a little bit more than that, but that's about what he'd be looking at, 15 or so actual served years.
Wow. And in your opinion, do you think that this deal, this plea offer, was justice in a way?
Well, again, to make those determinations, you have to have every fact. In these cases, the devil's in the details. And so whether it's a crime or whether it's something that just looks bad or whether it's something that isn't as bad as the prosecutors are saying, but still a crime, those are all in the minute details. So in this case, imagine that everything was just fine between the two of them. And then suddenly she got a text that came in that said something terrible. Maybe it's an affair, or maybe it's something like that. And he was triggered to act in that moment. And the evidence, if the evidence showed that that was boom, boom, like that, now you're talking consistent with what we've seen in American jurisprudence. You see sentences that are much lower in those 20 or 30-year ranges. If this is some sort of long-term domestic violence, though, and this was just the escalation to where it got way out of control and he had a deep issue, I think that we're on the very low end of things. So a lot more needs to be understood about what actually happened in that courtroom, and those records will eventually be available.
And I'm sure the family is eager, maybe not eager, but I'm sure the family wants more answers to the many questions that they probably still have. Andrew, I want to thank you so much for your insight into this case. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
The U.S. Naval Forces Japan spokesperson told the Stars and Stripes Christopher Olsen will have to forfeit all pay and allowances, and he must pay more than $10,600 in restitution to Jesse's family. Thanks so much for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner.